Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Wednesday, October 26th, and here's some of what we're talking about tonight. Some well-known campaign surrogates are on their way to Wisconsin. How much can they help the candidates running for governor and Senate? Then,
let's also talk about the elephant in the room. I had a stroke. He's never let me forget that.
John Fetterman's health was a big topic in last night's Pennsylvania Senate debate against Dr. Mehmet Oz. We'll look back at the debate and forward to where these campaigns go now. Also tonight, 3 men face prison time over a plot to kidnap Michigan's governor. More on today's verdict is just ahead. Plus, the investigation grows into Georgia's role in the 2020 presidential election. We'll explain how former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is involved now. And the United Nations warns the world is nowhere near hitting its climate targets. What does this mean for the future of the planet? Midterm election season is in full swing with less than 2 weeks to go. Early voting has started in a number of states, including in the battleground state of Wisconsin, and we're watching some key races there. Republican Senator Ron Johnson and Democratic Governor Tony Evers are both fighting to remain in office. Senator Johnson is in a close race against Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. As you can see, the polling puts them pretty close right now. Governor Evers is up against Republican challenger Tim Michels. Again, the polling is well within the margin of error. Today, Mr. Michels rallied with Virginia's Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. Governor Evers rallied with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and more surrogates are making their way to Wisconsin this week. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg will be there on Friday. Former President Obama visits this Saturday, and also Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott visits on Friday. Let's get into all that with MSNBC contributor Charlie Sykes. He is editor-at-large of The Bulwark. Mr. Sykes, long time no see. Welcome. It's good to see you.
Hey, it's great to see you, Joshua.
What do you make of all these surrogates coming to Wisconsin? What are folks saying about the impact that they might have or not?
Well, you know, everything in Wisconsin is close. All these elections tend to be decided by about 20,000 votes. So these surrogates will only affect the outcome on the margin, but that's where the races are determined. So if you're a Democrat, it really comes down to, are you going to get a big turnout out of the Madison area, out of Milwaukee, and are you going to turn out the youth vote? And I think that Elizabeth Warren could very much help with the youth vote in the Madison area, and Barack Obama could certainly help with the vote in Milwaukee. But again, these are very, very tough elections, and of course our airwaves are just slammed with back-to-back attack ads. And you know, because this is Wisconsin, both of these races are going to be decided probably by less than 1 point.
Why do you think these races are so close? For people who may not follow Wisconsin politics very tightly, what is it about the candidates, the race, the political climate right now that might contribute to these races appearing so close?
Well, in the governor's race, I think it was always going to be close. It was close in 2018 when Tony Evers beat Scott Walker. The Senate race is more interesting because Ron Johnson is, I think, the most vulnerable incumbent Republican in the entire country. He had very, very low negatives. Mandela Barnes, however, also is an Oppo researcher's dream. He's got a lot. He's been hammered with tens of millions of dollars with ads on everything from inflation to his personal finances, to crime, to the border, et cetera. So I actually find it somewhat interesting that he's been able to stay so close. But again, Ron Johnson normally would be facing huge headwinds, but in this particular year, I think what you're seeing is that Republicans are coming home and perhaps Democrats are as well. And the fact that Barack Obama is coming here this weekend really does underline the importance that the National Democratic Party puts on Wisconsin, because if they were to flip this seat, that changes the math in the United States Senate rather dramatically.
What about the shadow of 2020 in 2022? Different states are seeing this manifest in different ways, granted. There are still some lawsuits that are proceeding now during early voting. Obviously, Senator Ron Johnson has had a role to play in terms of the 2020 election and some of his comments about the outcome and the process. How much does 2020 feel present or distant now in 2022?
Well, it's obviously a cloud over all of the midterm elections, and of course, Ron Johnson played a significant role on January 6th. The stories about possibly delivering a fake slate of electors to Mike Pence. And he has gone down almost every single kooky rabbit hole, whether it's election denialism or vaccine skepticism. And I think that's one of the reasons why he has been so vulnerable, because in many ways he has been so extreme, but he's also been embarrassing. And I think that has become an issue in the race. But in terms of what's driving momentum right now, I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know when I say that most of the ads are talking about the cost of living. They're talking about the crime rates here in Wisconsin. They're talking about, the student loan relief rather than what happened on January 6th. So that hasn't been, and obviously also the abortion issue, which is playing a major role here in Wisconsin because it's very much a binary choice. But at the moment, not front and center. However, I will say that, of course, Republicans were under tremendous pressure from Donald Trump to run a bogus investigation, which really ended up splitting Republicans over how far to go in election denialism. And there's some bruised feelings still left over after that.
Of the surrogates who are showing up in Wisconsin, President Biden is not among them. He won the state of Wisconsin just by a hair's breadth in 2020, by about 20,000 votes. How do you see that decision in terms of him not campaigning there, at least not at the moment, not that we know of, to help Democratic candidates in Wisconsin?
Well, I think probably the Democrats are pretty satisfied with that decision because he is underwater. And so, you point out how close those elections were. Barack Obama won here twice comfortably. So he brings a whole different level of popularity here, and I think as I mentioned earlier, if the key to this race is in fact motivating Democratic voters to turn out in a midterm, which they do not always do, then that would be much more powerful than bringing in somebody who is he's underwater here in Wisconsin as he is nationally, Joe Biden.
What is your sense, just kind of stepping away from the top level politics for a second, what is your sense of how Wisconsinites are doing these days? I know the state's very diverse, and Milwaukee is not Madison, is not Waukesha, is not, it's a variety of different kind of enclaves around the state, which I think is what makes Wisconsin so fascinating. But what is your sense of how Wisconsinites are doing in terms of sending their kids to school and paying the bills and walking the streets safely? Like, what's the mood?
Well, you actually put your finger on it because there are so many different Wisconsins and they are really siloed off from one another. And this is one of the realities we have sorted out about as dramatically as any state in the country. And we could spend a lot of time talking about how the Milwaukee area, became one of the most racially segregated areas in North America, in the North. But to answer your question, I think that Wisconsinites are feeling the pinch from the economy. I think they feel the anxiety. I think there's a lot of focus on the rising crime rate here in Milwaukee. In fact, just today, we had the conclusion of a very, very dramatic trial about the Waukesha Christmas parade, murders, which really riveted attention here. So I think that all the campaigns are focusing on what are we going to do for working class, middle class Wisconsinites who are struggling to pay the bills, people who worry about the future of Medicare and Social Security, working people who have not received a raise in a decade, and whether or not they're going to be able to continue to afford to put food on the table, which is much more expensive here, and as well as filling up their gas tanks. So it's not much different here than it is in Michigan or Pennsylvania or any of these other battleground states.
And we'll talk more about some of those battleground states and about the result of that trial in Waukesha a little bit later. But for now, MSNBC contributor Charlie Sykes of The Bulwark, appreciate you coming on tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua.
So this time last night, Pennsylvania's Senate candidates were debating. I know you missed it because you were watching us, right? Well, today, reactions to that debate are mixed, but some voters said a few moments in that event made them cringe. Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman debated Republican Dr. Mehmet Oz. It was Fetterman's biggest campaign appearance since suffering a stroke back in May. His doctor, says the lieutenant governor, has symptoms of an auditory processing disorder. That means he can hear, but he's struggling to understand what he hears. Organizers accommodated Fetterman by providing a screen with live captions. Abortion was a key issue in the debate, but not before he addressed his health. After the debate, Fetterman's team focused on Dr. Oz's abortion comments. Fetterman's campaign claims to have raised more than $1 million just a few hours after the debate. Meanwhile, former President Trump plans to return to Pennsylvania just before the election to stump for both Dr. Oz and the gubernatorial candidate, Doug Mastriano. Let's continue now with NBC senior national politics reporter John Allen, who joins us from our Washington bureau. John, what are some of the reactions like to how Lieutenant Governor Fetterman and Dr. Oz performed?
Well, Joshua, let me first apologize to you for not watching your show last night so that I could watch the debate. Otherwise,
that's why we had you on tonight, so that you could apologize to my face. But it's okay. Go ahead.
You know, Democratic insiders in Pennsylvania and outside Pennsylvania expressed a lot of concern today to me and some of our colleagues at NBC who did a little bit of canvassing about their reaction to this debate, the only one between Fetterman and Oz. Some concern about not really feeling like they had been apprised of the amount of difficulty that Fetterman was going to have communicating clearly. At the same time, there were Democrats who said the issues were the big thing here, that there was a clear contrast between Fetterman and Oz on issues such as abortion that you brought up. Oz had a moment where he talked about abortion being between a woman, her doctor, and local political officials, which Democrats seized on. This is obviously the position of the Republican Party at this point, at least the candidates that are running in swing states. It's not an all-out ban, but they want to give local jurisdictions the ability to make those bans. I think today, though, the Oz people were feeling pretty good, and the Fetterman people were a little bit on their heels.
Can we dig a little further into that? Because there were some exchanges where the lieutenant governor struggled, it seemed, to form some answers or to follow some questions. He did have the open captioning on the screen behind him, and I'd like to dig into that a little more. Here is one cut where he was answering questions about hydraulic fracking for natural gas extraction, and the moderator tried to kind of wrangle him in terms of some contradictory comments that he's made in the past. John, I have to admit, I'm kind of two minds about this, right? On one hand, he is a candidate. He is asking for a very powerful office, and we have to hold him to the same standard as any other candidate. On the other hand, the man had a stroke. So judging him by the same verbal acuity standards as we would judge a television host like Dr. Oz seems a little strange. If Democrats feel bad about that, the man just had a stroke. How are people processing what they saw compared to what they expect from John Fetterman?
Well, I think we're going to find out from voters. I know Democrats in Pennsylvania have been focus grouping Fetterman for some time to find out how people react to a stroke, and I imagine that they'll do that kind of testing, showing clips of this debate. You know, with the fracking issue, this is one where he has had significant change over time. In 2018, he said that he never supported fracking. He didn't support fracking, never had. Last night he said he supports fracking and always has. And in between, we've seen comments that show a little bit of a migration on the issue. He talked to our colleague Dasha Burns in an interview last month in which he basically said that he supports fracking as long as it doesn't hurt the environment. So a little bit of a gray area for him, or a nuance, or having a little bit of both sides, if you want. Last night, obviously, much more definitive. Whether that was his intent or not, he said it repeatedly that he supports fracking. So I think we have to take him at his word that that's his position now.
Yeah, that may require a little more nuance. Although, to be fair, I have seen some of the more modern fracking operations in places like northern Colorado, and they have been able to find ways to be less intrusive to the environment, still intrusive, but the technology has come a long way. So there is a whole other conversation to be had about fracking. Can we also just note, by the way, that all the talk about John Fetterman, I think, has taken a lot of attention off of Dr. Oz, who has had a lot of criticism for an array of reasons, including his residency. I mean, is he going to be able to capitalize with that, or are those same questions that followed him into the primary still following him?
Right, Dr. Oz was a New York Giants fan until last night when he became a Philadelphia Eagles fan and said he'd be rooting for them.
Funny how that works,
in the upcoming game between the Eagles and the Steelers. Longtime New Jersey resident, first-time caller in Pennsylvania, I guess, is how you might say that about Oz. Yeah, he absolutely has had trouble. In fact, Oz has not led in a single major poll of this campaign since the general election began, but it has been getting more narrow over time, depending on which of the poll averages you look at. You're talking about basically 1-2 points separating the two of them right now, and that means it's still anybody's game with a couple weeks here left before the election.
Does that tell us anything about the fact that the former president is coming to Pennsylvania to campaign? I mean, we talked about why it's so close in Wisconsin with Charlie Sykes. The fact that it's this close in Pennsylvania, I don't know what we read into that or into Donald Trump coming as sort of a surrogate for the Republican candidates.
Oh, I'm glad you clarified you meant former President Trump coming in as opposed to former President Obama, who's also hitting the campaign trail for some of these Senate candidates. Look, I think that if you're a former president of the United States and you go in a Senate race, it's because you believe that it's a close race and it's one where you can have an impact and potentially put your party's candidate over the finish line. Trump obviously was very connected to Oz. Really the only reason that Oz won the Republican primary several months ago was a contentious race, and Trump came in hard for Oz, and Oz barely won that primary. So coming back to Pennsylvania, and of course we know Donald Trump likes to declare that he has won every race that he's ever gotten involved in, and of course that's not true, but still he pays attention to that record. He certainly wouldn't be going there if he thought the cause was lost.
If we had to pick, before I got to let you go, John, if there were one or two issues that might put those few independent, undecided voters over the top with this race, what might they be before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the issues we've largely been hearing about. Republicans have really focused in on crime as sort of a secondary issue to inflation in the economy. A lot of voters care about that. We've certainly heard a lot of reports of violent crime in major cities in recent months. So I think that's something the Republicans are going to really hammer hard, and I think the Democrats are going to talk about the limitation, particularly on abortion. We've heard a lot of that, and perhaps we're going to start to see and hear a little bit more of the argument that Republicans would be worse for the economy than Democrats would be going forward. I've heard that from some of the folks in the progressive wing recently, and particularly talking about Republican tax cuts perhaps fueling inflation if Republicans are given a chance to do that.
All right. Thank you, John. That's NBC senior national politics reporter John Allen with more on the races in Pennsylvania. Still to come, the plot to kidnap a governor. Today, a jury convicted 3 men for their plans to capture Michigan's governor. We'll break down the case and look ahead to the sentencing. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Today in Michigan, 3 men were convicted for their parts in a plot to kidnap Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. Paul Bellard, Joe Morrison, and Mr. Morrison's father-in-law, Pete Musico, are members of the Wolverine Watchmen. That's a paramilitary group. A jury found them guilty of providing material support for terrorist acts, possessing a firearm while committing a felony, and being members of a gang. They face up to 20 years in prison. Governor Whitmer is up for re-election. Today she tweeted, quote, "These verdicts are further proof that violence and threats have no place in our politics," unquote. She shared a similar sentiment during last night's gubernatorial debate. She shared the stage with Republican candidate Tudor Dixon.
My opponent has shown tonight that she's more interested in dividing us, halting our progress, and dragging us backwards. When she's not scripted and on stage, she stokes violence, spreads conspiracy theories.
Her radical policies have crushed the state. Her choices have been destructive. But don't worry, there is another choice.
Joining us now is Professor Barbara McQuaid of the University of Michigan Law School. She is a former U.S. attorney in Michigan. Professor, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Joshua. Great to be with you.
How do today's convictions fit into the larger prosecution of this plot to kidnap the governor?
Well, this is one of 3 cases, Joshua. There was a case in federal court against 4 other men. 2 of those men ultimately were acquitted, 2 convicted of the core plot. They were sort of the ringleaders of the plot, the men who actually planned to kidnap and put on trial Governor Whitmer. This group that we saw today was a group that was convicted of providing material support for assisting in the training and providing a location where they could train in firearms. They built what they called a shoot house where they could practice extracting her from the home if she had her security detail with her. And so that crime is in the state court. There's one more trial that's pending. That trial will begin later. There's still a probable cause hearing left to go in that case. And that's for 5 men who participated in surveillance at her vacation home in northern Michigan.
Remind us exactly what the end game of this plot was. As far as I remember, it was to make a political example of her, possibly even to kill her, right?
Yes. So, in Michigan, like many states, we were hit hard and rather divided about how best to respond to the COVID pandemic. Governor Whitmer was one who had some of the most aggressive and prompt responses to the COVID pandemic with shutdown orders. And not everybody liked that. So there were protests. Some of these men participated in protests at the Capitol. But what they did went well beyond political discourse and planned a violent attack where they would kidnap her from her vacation home. They had plans to bomb the underside of a bridge so that they could slow the police pursuit, take her and put her on trial for what they said was a violation of their constitutional rights. And I think this is such an important detail, they hoped that this act would start a civil war. I've seen this allegation before, and I've seen people dismiss it as fantasy, as idle talk, as something that they knew could never happen. It is not necessary to prove that they knew they would be successful, but it is enough to show that this was part of the plan, and that there are forces in this country that want to engage in violence because they can't get their way at the ballot box. It's a very dangerous phenomenon that we're seeing, and I think it's very gratifying to see these perpetrators brought to justice, not only to hold them accountable, but to deter others who might be like-minded.
It seems like a rather extensive plot that prosecutors were able to make a case around. What was their defense? Did they even try to claim that they didn't do this or they were being misunderstood? What kind of defense did they mount?
Well, a lot of the evidence was on tape, videotape, audio tape, so it's very difficult for people to deny something when there is that kind of documentary evidence. Instead, they use what is a common tactic in cases like this, and that is to claim that they were entrapped. There were FBI agents who infiltrated the group after one man who was training with the group, who was interested in training and shooting and learning how to do those things, the camaraderie, learned about plots that involved hurting police officers. And so he reported to a friend who was a police officer what he heard going on. And so as a result of that, FBI agents served in an undercover role to infiltrate the group and to collect evidence. And so that was the defense, that this was all idle chatter. It was really just in the imagination of the FBI that this plot was occurring. And these guys really were just engaged in tough talk. But I think the evidence that they were able to put on in both the federal case and in the state case rebutted any sort of claim of entrapment when they showed that these men were actively engaging in practice, in training, in drills, in extraction from a shoot house, that they actually went to the trouble of traveling all the way to northern Michigan, to Elk Rapids, to surveil the governor's vacation home. They went twice, and they also surveilled the underside of a bridge so that they could use explosives to detonate it, damage that bridge, and slow any police chase. So it's that conduct, not just their talk, that landed them these convictions.
I imagine that'll be a big factor. Everything you just mentioned will be a big factor in the sentencing. Talk us through that. I imagine from the prosecution's point of view, they would lay out everything that you just said to the judge and make it clear that, like, this was not cosplay, right? They weren't just expressing First Amendment beliefs about how terrible the governor was. They were actually doing things that made it clear that they were not bluffing.
Yeah, so in this case, the convictions that happened today, the men face up to 20 years in prison. Now, the court will assess their culpability, will apply sentencing guidelines, and most often the sentence ends up being something less than that. I'm sure the defendants will argue that they were led astray, they were misunderstood, that this got out of hand. But the prosecution, no doubt, will point to the seriousness of their conduct. Not only that they were willing to engage in violence against another human, but they were willing to engage in violence against the governor of the state, a person who by her position and her authority, they were seeking to undermine. They were engaging in political violence to achieve in the streets what they could not achieve in the ballot box. And that is so damaging to democracy. So I imagine that the government will be seeking a very strong sentence to deter other people who might be inclined to engage in similar activity in the future.
Before I have to let you go, I think it's easy for people to look at cases like this and say that things are getting worse, right? That they're worse than they've ever been, that political violence and all this rhetoric has made things crazy. I kind of always wonder whether this is something different or this is just something that we're noticing more because of the political times that we're in. And if you talk to a prosecutor or an investigator, they'd be like, I could tell you stories from 20 years ago that would stand your teeth on edge. Is this getting worse, or are we just noticing it more?
I think it's getting worse. I think part of it is that social media allows like-minded people to find each other. It allows them to normalize their behavior. And so what used to be, a disgruntled guy in his basement is now somebody who can connect with others. They hear from leaders of political movements that someone has stolen the election and that if we don't fight like hell, we're not going to have a country anymore. Those kinds of statements land with certain people in a way that sparks action. And so I do think that the threat is greater than ever before. But the silver lining here, I think, is that law enforcement was able to respond to this plot and jurors were able to see this case for what it was and return guilty verdicts.
Michigan law professor Barbara McQuaid, always good talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua.
We will get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including concerns over pro-China messages influencing American voters, a court order for former President Trump's chief of staff to testify, and a verdict for the man who plowed an SUV through a Christmas parade last year. Tonight's headlines begin with election propaganda. Internet researchers say they've discovered accounts across social media pushing pro-China messages to American voters. These posts have apparently popped up as recently as this month, but it's unclear whether they've made an impact. NBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney has more on this. Hey, Ken.
That's right, Joshua. Two companies that study online influence operations published research this week showing what appears to be a Chinese propaganda campaign using fake social media accounts to target American voters ahead of the U.S. midterm elections. Now, so far, it doesn't appear that these influence operations have been all that effective. But this suggests that China is experimenting with disinformation aimed at Americans to a greater extent than it has in the past. Researchers say the Chinese are increasingly attempting to emulate the successful Russian political influence campaign of 2016, which involved an extensive use of fake accounts. Now, U.S. intelligence officials say they see no evidence of any cyber campaign by foreign adversaries that could impact the security of the vote count, but they also say it's hard to measure the impact of foreign disinformation. Mandiant, a cybersecurity company recently acquired by Google, said today that they documented a campaign sympathetic to China that included videos made to seem like they were posted by Americans. Those videos pushed pro-Chinese messages and downplayed the effectiveness of voting in the U.S. Meanwhile, Alethea, a company that studies disinformation online, said some of the Chinese propaganda echoed right-wing extremist content and even alluded to the QAnon conspiracy theory. Neither company is able to link these campaigns directly to the Chinese government, but analysts say there are no other likely suspects. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for China's embassy in Washington denied that China was responsible for any foreign election interference efforts. Joshua?
All right. Thank you, Ken. That's NBC's Ken Delaney reporting. Today, former President Trump's lawyers officially received the subpoena from the January 6th House Committee. That subpoena orders Mr. Trump to testify on November 14th, in person or remotely. He has until next Friday to turn over documents related to the attack on the Capitol. NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles has more. Hey, Ryan.
Yeah, Joshua, two important developments in two separate investigations into the events that led to January 6th. The first comes in the subpoena that was issued by the January 6th Select Committee of the former President Donald Trump. We can confirm that attorneys for the former president have accepted service of that subpoena. This is just a process step. It was expected, but it is important because now the committee and the former president can begin deliberations over if and when he will sit for a deposition under oath in in front of the committee. Now, there's no guarantee that that is going to happen, but this was a necessary step in that direction. Of course, you'll remember the committee set a deadline of November 4th for Trump to hand over documents and November 14th for him to sit with that deposition. There is the possibility that both of those deadlines could get pushed back if his attorneys do engage with the committee on some level. So we'll have to see. Now, in the other investigation that was important today, that's the investigation into election interference in Fulton County, Georgia, which the district attorney there, Fani Willis, has really escalated. And part of what she's hoping to do is get some associates very close to the former president to sit before a grand jury. Among them, Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff. Now, Meadows believes that he should not have to do that because of his role as chief of staff, that executive privilege protects him from having to answer questions. He went before a judge in South Carolina to ask that this request be blocked. Now, the request came in South Carolina because that's where Meadows currently lives. That judge denied the request and ordered him to sit before the grand jury. Now, it's not as simple as Meadows now just driving down to Atlanta and sitting before this grand jury. He is expected to appeal to a higher court. Now, this could end up in the Supreme Court, much like Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, who's also been asked to sit in front of this grand jury. As of right now, Graham's request from the Fulton County District Attorney has been stayed by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas before the entire Supreme Court can rule on his request. It's very likely that Meadows' request could make it all the way to that level as well. But Willis, the district attorney there, said that she's going to continue to push to get these high-level Trump officials involved. She believes they are a key to her overall investigation. Joshua?
All right, thank you, Ryan. That's NBC's Ryan Nobles reporting from Capitol Hill. A man faces life in prison for killing 6 people during a Christmas Day parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Today, a jury found Darrell Brooks guilty on all 76 criminal charges, including intentional homicide. They deliberated for just 3 hours. Mr. Brooks represented himself during the trial. He repeatedly interrupted the judge, the witnesses, the prosecutors. At one point, the judge had him removed from court. Last year's attack killed 6 people. Dozens more were injured. Brooks faces a mandatory life sentence. More of America's school buses are going electric. Today, the Biden administration announced nearly $1 billion of subsidies for electric buses across the country. The new buses will be mostly electric. Some will simply be low-emission vehicles. But the administration says they will reduce greenhouse gases, save money, and improve children's health.
Who doesn't love a yellow school bus, right? Can you raise your hand if you love a yellow school bus, right? There's something about, and most of us, many of us went to school on the yellow school bus, right? And it's part of our experience growing up.
I don't know, those experiences were mixed for me. But anyway, about 25 million children ride yellow school buses every day. Speaking of reducing emissions, up next we'll talk more about climate change. We know the world is not doing enough to reduce greenhouse gases, but a new UN report lays out just how far behind we are and what the consequences of that could be. That's just ahead. Stay close. The United Nations has a new report with a familiar warning about climate change, that the world is not doing enough to stop it. But now we have an updated picture of how serious things are. The UN says the planet is on track to warm an average of nearly 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is nearly twice as much as the goal set in the Paris Climate Accords back in 2015. It also crosses the threshold that scientists say makes catastrophic climate change irreversible. Joining us now is Brahim Al-Husseini. He's the founder and managing partner of Full Cycle, a climate-focused investment company. Mr. Al-Husseini, welcome. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Joshua. It's good to be back. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, although not as well after hearing about this UN report. What do you make of it?
It's a mixed bag. You know, as you said, we are bending the curve downward overall, so that's a good piece of news, but we're not doing it fast enough. You know, the original goal of 1.5 degrees, which we were trying to, this is of warming of to prior to pre-industrial levels by the end of the century, was a minimal goal just to be able to recognize climate to some degree. It's already too much of a difference compared to where we were in the past. But getting to 2.1 to 2.9 Celsius is a world we're not going to recognize. Every fraction of a degree is tens of millions of people whose life is going to be impacted adversely. There's going to be massive economic disruption. We're talking about, extreme floods, droughts, a world that we're not going to recognize, and we're not taking it seriously enough, obviously.
You said that this was a mixed bag. That means that there is bad and good news. And I hear you in terms of bending that curve somewhat. Can you elaborate on that for just a minute? What are we doing to bend the curve, and where are we seeing it be most effective?
So the world got together in 2015 at something called COP 21 in Paris and agreed together collectively that we are going to lower emissions over time and keep emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, which again is over pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. And what that means is it's going to be catastrophic to some degree. I mean, it equates to something like 70% of coral reefs bleaching, 70 million climate refugees, X percentage of global GDP disruption. But collectively, that's what we agreed that we can get to, and that's what we were shooting for. And where we ended up is, we are bending the curve downward. So it's not like the world completely ignored it, but the emission reduction has not been met with, and the strengthening of the emission reductions has not been to the degree that we all agreed to. And it was supposed to be strengthened every year. For example, coming up to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is happening in November, the next COP meeting, which is the UN Conference for Climate Change, only 24 nations out of 193 increased strengthened their commitments. And most of those nations are small nations that are not big emitters anyway. The only big one that strengthened their commitment is India. China and the US, the two biggest emitters, have not done so. So we have a fundamental problem. Now we're on a trajectory to get to 2.1 or 2.9, between 2.1 and 2.9 degrees Celsius, which, like you said, is 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a world that's honestly unrecognizable to us. I mean, when we heard about what happened to Pakistan this year, where a third of the whole nation got flooded, we can't fathom what that would mean for a country like ours, even to be 3% flooded.
So can I just ask the blunt question? Are we screwed? Like, is it too late? Are we done?
So it's going to get worse before it gets better. But, with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest climate bill in history, and we've spoken about that on your show before, we are starting to correct course. We are addressing things that are very important, like methane. Methane, for example, is the second most abundant greenhouse gas, and it's 86 times more heat trapping than CO2 in the first 20 years of it in the atmosphere. And those are the 20 years that we care about, because we want to front load the impact of the work that we're doing. The world is now starting to realize that, hey, something like methane, if we focus on it and sign the methane pledge, which countries like China have not yet signed, will allow us to buy more time so we can quickly decarbonize the economy. So we at Full Cycle, for example, we're dedicating our career and our time to transitioning from a high carbon to a low carbon economy in the fastest time frame possible. And we know that many other institutions are doing the same thing. So we remain hopeful. We just need everybody to get on the same train, because we all live in this closed sphere in the middle of space together. There's no other place that's going to house us. So we need to get really serious about this issue and start reversing this trend that we've been on now, for over 100 years, 150 years.
Before I have to let you go, the cost of making all these changes has been the enormous bugaboo for a number of years. But over the last few years, it looks like the market for green energy has kind of exploded. Like, there are a number of companies, even legacy oil and energy companies, that have begun to pull towards more sources of green energy. How do you see the business of green energy, just the profit center that it could represent, as an incentive to the world to finally do what we need to do to save our own lives?
Yeah, so we've been in this space for 21 years, and we've been screaming from the rooftops that this is something that has to happen. And we're so heartened that this has become the biggest investment opportunity in human history, because everything has to be upgraded. our food systems, water systems, transportation systems, and it's become really the biggest investment opportunity out there. And yes, the energy companies the world over have stopped funding climate denial and now are investing in renewable energy in all its different forms. So we tip our hats to them. They did get us to some degree into this mess in many different ways, but now they're the biggest investors in the space, and they're transitioning themselves from being the old legacy dirty companies to the new legacy clean companies because the money's there, and we understand that, and we'll take it.
Brahim Al-Husseini, I appreciate you making time to talk this through with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me again.
Up next, a potential breakthrough for fighting leukemia. Dr. John Torres tells us how genetic technology could save more lives. Before we go. Childhood cancers are mercifully rare, and the American Cancer Society says patients have a high survival rate. Now there's new hope for treating tougher cases of leukemia with genetic technologies. Researchers are experimenting with combining two gene-modifying therapies. Early findings suggest the combination could be safe for children who don't benefit from conventional treatments. But is it safe enough to use widely? And more importantly, will it work? NBC senior medical correspondent Dr. John Torres joins us back here now at the table, and this is really remarkable research in its early stages, but we'll get to that in just a second. First of all, explain the technology under this. We're talking about a gene editing technology called CRISPR. What is that?
It's a combination of two different gene therapies. One has been conventional, something that's been used, which is called the CAR T therapy, and this is for children with leukemia that essentially need this treatment in order to survive and live. And for the majority of children, this works well. But there are those that CAR T therapy doesn't work, so they've added this CRISPR technology. And CRISPR is that gene editing technology that's out there. Small trial, like you mentioned, but in this trial, they found that CRISPR technology could really help push along that CAR T technology and could really help these children. And we think we'll be saving children's lives.
I don't want to overstate what CRISPR does, but the way I've sometimes heard it described is as gene editing, where you can kind of sequence the genetics of something and see it as just A's, C's, T's, and G's, and literally, like a Word document, decide to try to pull pieces out and move them around. Is that oversimplified?
No, it's not oversimplifying at all. What it does is it goes in there essentially with big scissors and cuts out part of a gene, can replace it with a different part of a gene, and can modify that. The reason this is important here is because that CAR T therapy is basically what they do is they take the child's own blood, they go ahead and they transpose it with this CAR T therapy and then give it back to the child, and that's what gives them those T cells they need in order to get through this leukemia once they end up getting rid of all their immune system cells, basically. But the problem is that takes a few months to happen, and sometimes these children don't have a few months to live, and so they wanted to find something that would open it up for these children so their body didn't reject it. That's that host organ rejection thing. They didn't reject it at this point, and this is what that CRISPR technology is allowing them to do.
So it's kind of similar to when you're trying to transplant an organ with somebody and making sure that your body does not attack it like a foreign object.
And that's exactly what it is, because blood is like an organ, and if you put the wrong blood in there from somebody else, your body will attack it. In this case, with that CRISPR technology, they were able to convince the body that, hey, this is not something to attack.
I know we talk about gene editing, gene splicing, and so on, and maybe I've just watched Resident Evil too many times. We're not talking about changing the child's core genetic code.
Not
We're
at all.
Altering the genetics
Not at all.
of a sample of their blood that will kind of inspire their body, allow their body to learn how to do something to save itself.
And more importantly, it's not even a sample of their blood. It's a sample of blood that could be from somebody else. It's off the shelf, as they call it. And the best description I can give is what the experts are talking about. It's essentially like going in and getting a suit put on. You can buy an off-the-rack suit. It's going to fit the vast majority of people. If you get a tailored suit, it's going to fit better, but not everybody can get a tailored suit. Tailors aren't always available. And so getting that one where you can basically combine the two and get a suit that fits well, it's kind of like this. Basically you're getting that blood that can get in there, that can save the lives, give them the T cells they need, and not get rejected.
Let me carry that metaphor even further, probably because I'm a little persnickety because I just got tailored suits that don't fit even though they tailored them to me. But what kind of stunned me about that, and what I wonder about this, is how far the tailoring goes, right? No human body is perfectly according to the textbook. So what are some of the limitations of what we can do with this?
So some of the limitations here with leukemia are, this is right now reserved for those that would have what we call refractory leukemia. So in other words, it's leukemia that's not able to be treated by other methods. And like I mentioned, they might only have a couple months to live. And so again, this was a phase 1 trial whose sole purpose is to look at the safety behind this, and they found out it was fairly safe in this instance. Some of the children had problems during this treatment because it can happen, and some of them had what's called a cytokine storm. In other words, they ended up having their immune system attack their own body, and they had to be treated. And so, moving forward, we don't know how far we can go with this treatment. We don't know how well it can be, but it's not necessarily tailored to individuals because it's opening it up so that individuals themselves can get this off-the-shelf treatment without their body rejecting it.
You mentioned it's a phase 1 trial. Clinical trials like this are phase 1, 2, 3. Phase 1 is just to see if it can be introduced to the body. If it's safe at all. So the cytokine storm where the body goes, what is that? That's something they'll have to consider.
Exactly.
Phase 2 is whether or not it even works. So we're still in really early days in terms of whether this could be used more broadly.
And there were 6 children in this trial, so it's a very small trial. And like I mentioned, with this leukemia, 90% of children have a 5-year survival rate that once they get to the 5-year point, they're considered cured. But there's those 10% or even smaller amounts that don't get that survival rate, that can't be treated with conventional methods. And unfortunately, some of them do end up dying. This could be that life-saving tool they need. And so they'll continue with the phase 2 trial now that they've gotten through the phase 1. If that's proven to be efficacious, effective, then they'll move on to phase 3, which is in more children, and then it'll be ready for the market.
With regard to CRISPR, though, just to kind of detour a little bit, we've heard a lot lately about new genetic technologies being used for existing health challenges. COVID, right? The mRNA vaccines.
Exactly.
I interviewed Dr. Anthony Fauci, I think it was last year, and we talked about the possibility for that kind of technology to be used on other diseases like HIV, which has been a holy grail for generations of trying to figure out how to treat people with these diseases. How do you see the prospect of genetic technology, genetic editing to cure these pernicious diseases? I don't want to get a false sense of security, but gosh, they can do so much now.
And they can do so much, but I think the thing we need to realize too is these are one tool in our tool bag, and it's not the only tool, and it's not the ultimate tool, but it is one tool, because even with these technologies, like we mentioned, some of these children had a cytokine storm. It went a little too far, and so we need to know not just how to do the technology, the CRISPR, but how not to necessarily do it, or only do it partly, and make sure we're targeting what we need to target. The body's amazing. Viruses are interesting the way they can attack the body, and we're learning how to attack the viruses, which is the important part. CRISPR is going to go a long way in helping us do that.
So for parents who have kids who are dealing with childhood leukemia, or even for family members who are still learning about it, it sounds like the treatments that exist are pretty good, but now there will be even more kids potentially who can be helped.
Exactly. The treatments are great. Again, the survival rate's over 90%, but for those that aren't being able to be treated with what we currently have, then this is one step in that direction. So hopefully within the next few years, we see it getting through those trials and being available.
It's so fascinating. Such fascinating technology. NBC Senior Medical Correspondent Dr. John Torres. Doctor, thanks very much.
You bet. Thank you.
And hey, thank you for making time for us. You can send us your thoughts on this new treatment or the fight against climate change or the midterms or anything at all that we discussed tonight or any night. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can leave us a brief but brilliant voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. And remember, you can always take Now Tonight with you as a podcast on your favorite podcasting app. So until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.